You ever wonder how the decisions a government makes about its budget can actually affect things like the job market or even your own financial future years down the line? Well, that's exactly what we're getting into today. We're going to explore fiscal policy and how it can shape a country's economic destiny.
So, that brings us to the big question right at the heart of this explainer. Can a government's choices about taxing and spending really make a whole country more prosperous in the long run? It's a huge question, and the answer, as you'll see, is pretty complex.
Now, to make sure we're on solid ground here, our whole analysis is based on a really important piece of research. It's the 2015 International Monetary Fund policy paper called Fiscal Policy and Long-Term Growth. This gives us a credible, evidence-based framework to work from.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll get on the same page about what fiscal policy actually is. Then, we'll look at the one thing that has to happen before any real growth can start. After that, we'll check out the tools governments can use, see what happens when those tools don't work, and finally, wrap it all up with the art of finding the right balance.
So first things first, when we talk about fiscal policy, what do we really mean? The easiest way to think about it is like a government's financial blueprint. What it really boils down to is this. Fiscal policy is how a government uses its two main financial levers, bringing money in, mostly through taxes, and sending money out, through spending, to try and steer the country's economy in the right direction. It's all about managing that flow of money.
All right, let's move on. Before a country can even start thinking about boosting long-term growth, it needs to get its house in order. You have to build on a stable foundation. And according to the IMF, this isn't just a good idea, it's an absolute must.
And that foundation has a name: macroeconomic stability. The IMF paper is crystal clear on this. It is the non-negotiable first step. Without it, any grand plans for growth are basically built on quicksand.
So what does this instability look like in the real world? Well, you see things like government debt that's not just high, but getting higher. You see big budget deficits that never seem to go away. You get inflation that's all over the place. And all of this creates uncertainty. And if you're a business, uncertainty is the enemy. It makes you hesitant to invest, to hire, to expand, all the things that actually drive growth.
The paper really singles out high public debt as a major problem. See, when a government borrows a ton of money, it's competing for that money with private companies. This can drive up borrowing costs and crowd out private investment. It also means that when a crisis hits, the country has way less financial firepower to respond. And you can actually see this stability-first idea play out in the real world. Take Chile in the 1970s. Before they had their big economic boom, what did they do? They focused on getting stable. They made some tough choices, cutting spending and making their tax system more effective. This fixed their budget and created the stable platform that later growth was built upon.
Okay, so let's say a country has that stable foundation. Now what? Well, this brings us to the pro-growth toolkit. These are the specific levers a government can pull to actively try and create long-term growth.
According to the IMF paper, there are four main pathways here. Governments can use fiscal policy to get more people into the workforce, to encourage businesses to invest, to improve the skills and education of their citizens, that's human capital, and to boost overall efficiency, which economists call productivity. Let's zoom in on that labor supply channel, with Germany as an example. In the early 2000s, they lowered what's called the tax wedge. Basically, that's the gap between what an employer pays for a worker and what that worker actually takes home after taxes. By shrinking that wedge, work became more attractive. At the same time, they tweaked social benefits to nudge people back into the job market. And the result? A pretty big jump in employment, especially for older workers.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The IMF ran the numbers, and smart fiscal reforms could add about 3/4 of a percentage point to long-term growth in advanced economies. But look at the potential for developing countries. For emerging markets, the potential gain is almost 3%. That is a massive, life-changing difference. It shows just how powerful these policies can be.
Okay, so besides getting more people to work, another huge tool is getting businesses to invest. Governments can do this by making their corporate tax systems more efficient and attractive, and by offering smart, targeted incentives for things like research and development, which really fuels innovation.
And we've seen different flavors of this strategy work. Ireland is the classic example. They used low corporate tax rates to attract a massive amount of foreign investment, which totally transformed their economy. Malaysia took a different path. They cut back on inefficient government-run projects and used that money to build better infrastructure, which then helped the private sector to thrive.
But, and this is a big but, these tools aren't magic wands. Policies can and do fail. So that brings us to the question, why does policy sometimes fall short?
The answer, it turns out, is all in the details. It's about the design.
So you've got growth-friendly designs on one side. Think broad tax systems with low rates, smart public spending on things everyone needs, like good roads, and social benefits that go to the people who actually need them. On the other side, you've got growth-harming designs, weird tax breaks that warp business decisions, subsidies that are poorly targeted, like for energy, and bloated government payrolls. The design makes all the difference.
And here's a really critical warning from the paper. It says that when governments try to fix their budgets just by slashing spending, it often makes inequality worse. And this isn't just a social problem. The paper argues that rising inequality can actually hurt long-term growth because if a big chunk of the population gets left behind, it can lead to instability and weaken the whole economy.
So all of this brings us to our final and maybe most important point. This is really an art, not a science. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. The right approach is all about balance and depends completely on a country's unique circumstances.
And this table from the paper illustrates that perfectly. Look, for an advanced economy with an aging population, things like pension and health reform are a super high priority. But for an emerging economy, maybe the most urgent tasks are building basic infrastructure or just getting better at collecting taxes. The right tool depends entirely on the job you need to do.
So if you take away just one thing, let it be this. A successful fiscal policy that actually boosts growth is like a three-legged stool. You need that solid foundation of macroeconomic stability. You need smart, careful policy design. And, this is key, you need to build social consensus so that people believe the reforms are fair and are willing to stick with them.
Which leaves us with the big, ongoing question for every country on the planet. The goal isn't just growth for growth's sake. It's about what kind of growth we want. The real challenge is finding that delicate fiscal balance that builds a future that isn't just more prosperous, but more equitable too.